The room was silent. Not the kind of silence before applause, but the kind that comes when a dream is about to break. Freddie Mercury stood there, eyes distant, voice low, and said the words no one was prepared to hear. "I don't think I can do this anymore." In that moment, the world's most powerful voice was on the verge of disappearing. What followed that confession, in the next few hours, would change Freddie's life forever, revive a fire he believed was gone, and create one of the most emotional turning points of his entire career. Before this story ends, you'll discover why Freddie wanted to walk away, who reached him in that fragile moment, and what happened next that would shock even his closest friends. This is not a story about quitting. It's a story about finding a reason to stay. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss our emotional stories about Freddie Mercury. The studio lights felt colder than usual. Freddie Mercury sat alone on the edge of the couch, his reflection faintly visible in the glass wall that separated the control room from the recording booth. The room smelled of coffee, old cables, and exhaustion. Outside, the city rain pressed against the windows, blurring the skyline into streaks of silver and gray. He had been here for 12 hours. 12 hours of retakes. 12 hours of voices in his head. 12 hours of feeling like the music no longer belonged to him. Brian stood behind the console, arms crossed, watching Freddie with concern. Roger paced the floor. John sat quietly near the wall, pretending to tune his bass. No one spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. Freddie rubbed his temples and exhaled sharply. His voice, the very thing the world worshipped, felt distant, unreachable, like something that belonged to another life. Every time he stepped into the booth, the notes came out hollow, forced. He stood suddenly. "I can't do this anymore." The words fell into the room like glass. Brian looked up. "What?" Freddie didn't repeat it louder. He repeated it truer. "I don't think I can keep singing." The room froze. Roger stopped pacing. John lifted his head. The tape machine hummed quietly, unaware it had just witnessed a fracture in a legend. Freddie's hands trembled slightly, but he didn't hide them. "I'm empty," he continued. "I walk onto stages, and I feel like I'm borrowing a voice that doesn't belong to me anymore." Brian stepped forward. "Freddie, you're tired. We all are." "This isn't tired," Freddie replied. "This is something else." He moved to the window, staring at the rain. The city glowed faintly below, alive and unaware of what was happening inside that room. For years, he had outrun this feeling of performance, excess, and noise. Now it had caught him. He turned back to them. "I think I'm done." No one answered, not because they didn't care, because they were afraid of what it meant. Freddie lowered himself back onto the couch, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. He stared at the floor. "I don't recognize myself when I sing anymore," he said quietly. "It used to feel like flying. Now it feels like pretending I still remember how." Roger's voice cracked. "You're Freddie Mercury." Freddie laughed softly. "That's the problem." The door creaked open. A young sound engineer peeked in, sensed attention, and quietly backed away. Outside, the world kept moving. Inside, something sacred was breaking. Brian sat beside him. "Do you remember why you started?" Freddie closed his eyes. He remembered his childhood bedroom, the first piano, the hunger, the fire. "I don't feel it anymore," Freddie said. Brian placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then we wait until you do." Freddie shook his head. What if it doesn't come back? The question hung in the air. What if the voice that defined a generation had reached its end? Later that night, Freddie walked alone through the city. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement shining beneath streetlights. He passed bars where music spilled onto sidewalks, past theaters glowing with promise. He felt none of it. He reached his apartment, closed the door behind him, and leaned against it, eyes closed. For the first time in his life, Freddie Mercury didn't know who he was without his voice. He poured a drink, didn't touch it, sat at the piano, didn't play. He stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. "How did I lose you?" he whispered to the silence. Sleep never came. At dawn, Freddie stood on his balcony, watching the sky change colors, wondering if the man who sang for the world was still somewhere inside him. His phone rang. He almost didn't answer. Freddie, the voice said. It was someone he hadn't spoken to in years. A woman from his past. Someone who had known him before the stages. Before the legend. "I heard you're not well," she said. Freddie laughed bitterly. That's one way to say it. There was a pause. "You still owe me a song," she said gently. Freddie closed his eyes. "I don't have one anymore." Her voice softened. "Come see me?" He hesitated. He didn't know why he agreed. But he did, and that decision, made in exhaustion and uncertainty, would carry him toward a moment that either saved his voice or ended it forever. The drive to the coast took longer than Freddie Mercury expected. He didn't mind. The gray road stretched endlessly, bordered by wet fields and distant trees stripped bare by winter. The radio played quietly, but Freddie didn't listen. His thoughts were louder than any song. He had no idea why he was going. He only knew that staying still was unbearable. By the time he reached a small seaside town, the clouds had broken apart, revealing streaks of pale sunlight over the water. The ocean smelled of salt and something old, something honest. He parked near the pier and walked until he found the cafe she had mentioned. It hadn't changed much. He stood there for a moment, suddenly uncertain, then pushed the door open. She was already there. Older, yes, but unmistakable. Her hair streaked with silver now, her posture calmer, her eyes steady in a way that made Freddie feel immediately transparent. "Hello, Farrick," she said. He hadn't heard that name in years. "Hello, Lena." They sat by the window. For a while they didn't speak. The sound of waves filled the silence. "I almost didn't come," Freddie said finally. She smiled. "I almost didn't call." He studied her face, searching for the girl he once knew, the one who had sat on the floor with him in college, listening to him play broken melodies on an old piano. "You look tired," she said gently. "I am." She nodded, as if she had expected nothing else. "I heard what you said in the studio," she continued, "that you wanted to stop." Freddie's jaw tightened. News travels fast. "Truth travels faster," she replied. They ordered tea. Freddie wrapped his hands around the warm cup. "I don't feel like myself," he said. "I feel like I lost a boy who believed music could change things." Lena watched him carefully. "Do you remember why you sang in the first place?" He shook his head. "I don't think I ever knew." She leaned back. "You sang because you were lonely, and because you wanted to be seen." Freddie laughed softly. "Well, that worked." "No," she said. "Not like this." The word struck something inside him. After the cafe, Lena led him along the beach. The wind cut through his coat, but he welcomed it. It felt real. They walked until the town disappeared behind them. She stopped near the water and looked at him. "Sing something," she said. He shook his head immediately. "I can't." "Not for the world," she replied. "For yourself." Freddie stared at the waves. "I don't know who I am without the stage," he admitted. Lena stepped closer. "That's why you need to sing here." Freddie's chest tightened. "I don't hear the music anymore," he whispered. She placed her hand on his arm. "Then listen." They stood in silence. Wind, water, gulls overhead. Slowly, almost unwillingly, a melody surfaced in Freddie's mind, faint, fragile. He opened his mouth. The sound came out broken, but it was there. He closed his eyes, sang again, not loud, not perfect, but real. When he finished, he was shaking. Lena smiled through tears. "You're still in there." Freddie pressed his palms against his face. "I'm afraid," he said. "So was the boy I knew," she replied. "And he sang anyway." They stood together as the sun slipped lower, the sky bleeding into gold. Freddie felt something stir in his chest. Hope. But as they walked back toward the town, his phone buzzed. The message would change everything, because the studio wanted an answer by morning, and the choice Freddie made next would decide whether his voice would survive or disappear forever. Freddie Mercury didn't answer the message right away. The phone lay on the table between him and Lena, its screen dark now, but its weight still present in the room. The studio wanted a decision by morning, return and continue recording, or step away indefinitely. In other words, choose the voice or lose it. Freddie stood by the window of the small guest room Lena had offered him, staring at the moonlit ocean. Waves rolled in with patient certainty, as if they knew something he did not. "I don't know what to do," he said quietly. Lena leaned against the doorframe. "Then don't decide yet." He laughed softly. "That's the problem. I don't have time." She crossed the room and stood beside him. "You have tonight." They sat on the edge of the bed, the silence between them filled with everything unsaid. Freddie rubbed his hands together, restless, afraid to touch the truth. "If I go back," he said, "I'm afraid I'll be pretending again." "And if you don't?" she asked. "I'm afraid I'll disappear." Lena studied him. "You're not your voice, Freddie." He looked at her sharply. "The world disagrees." She shook her head. "The world doesn't know you." "I do." He closed his eyes. "Stay," she said. Freddie didn't answer. He barely slept. Before dawn, he walked down to the beach alone. The sky was pale, the horizon thin with light. He stopped with the sand at the water and listened. He thought of the stadiums, the lights, the noise, the expectations. Then he thought of the boy at the piano, the hunger, the need, the dream. And for the first time in years, he sang. Not for fame, not for success, for himself. The song was unfinished, fragile, but alive. When the sun finally broke over the ocean, Freddie knew. He returned to the house and picked up the phone. "I'm coming back," he told the studio, "but on my terms." There was hesitation on the other end, then agreement. He packed quietly. Lena watched him from the doorway. "You found it," she said. "I found myself," Freddie replied. As he drove away, the ocean shrinking in his mirror, Freddie felt both terrified and certain. But he had no idea what awaited him at the studio, because the moment he stepped back into that world, everything would change. The studio door closed behind Freddie with a familiar, heavy sound. For a moment, he stood still, letting the scent of cables, wood, and old coffee settle around him. It had only been a few days since he left, but it felt like a lifetime ago. The walls were the same. The instruments waited in their places. Yet everything inside him had shifted. Brian looked up from the console, surprise flickering across his face. "You came back," he said. Freddie nodded. "On my terms." Roger raised an eyebrow. "We're listening." Freddie met their eyes. No rushing, no forcing. "If I don't feel it, we stop." They exchanged glances. Then Brian smiled. "All right." Freddie stepped into the booth. The microphone hung in front of him, silent and unforgiving. He placed his hands on the stand, steadying himself. The glass between him and the others reflected his face, familiar yet new. "Whenever you're ready," Brian said through speakers. Freddie closed his eyes. He thought of the ocean, the wind, the fragile song at dawn. He opened his mouth. The first note trembled, not weak, vulnerable. The room went still. He continued. The melody unfolded slowly, cautious but true. The voice he feared was gone returned, not as a weapon, but as a companion. He wasn't chasing perfection anymore. He was listening. When the song ended, no one spoke. Roger finally whispered, "Bloody hell." Freddie stepped out of booth, heart pounding. "That was different," John said softly. Freddie nodded. "I know." Hours passed. They worked carefully, patiently. Each take carried more strength, more clarity. Freddie laughed for the first time in weeks. But as the day wore on, exhaustion crept in. The old fear whispered again. By evening, his voice cracked. He stopped. "I'm done for today." No one argued. That night, alone in his apartment, Freddie stared at the ceiling, mind racing. Was this sustainable? Or was this just a brief return before the fall? The next morning, he received a message. The producers wanted him on stage. A surprise appearance. A live audience. In 3 days, Freddie's chest tightened. The test was coming, and he didn't know if his voice or his heart was ready. The venue glowed like a promise in the dark. Freddie Mercury stood backstage, listening to the crowd gather beyond the curtain. The murmur of thousands of voices rose and fell like waves against a distant shore. It was the same sound he had known for years, familiar, powerful, yet tonight it carried something different, uncertainty. 3 days earlier, he had barely trusted himself to sing alone at dawn. Now he was about to step before a live audience with nothing but the fragile truth he had rebuilt inside him. Brian approached quietly. "How are you holding up?" Freddie smiled faintly. "Ask me in 5 minutes." He closed his eyes and breathed. He thought of the ocean, the quiet song, the boy at the piano, the man he had become. When the stage manager signaled, Freddie stepped forward. The lights exploded around him. The roar of the crowd hit his chest like a wave, familiar and overwhelming. For a moment, the old fear whispered, "What if the voice is gone? What if they hear the cracks?" Freddie lifted the microphone. He didn't chase the noise. He let it pass. Then he spoke. "I almost walked away from this." The crowd hushed. "I almost gave up singing. Not because I didn't love it, but because I forgot why I did it." Silence stretched. Freddie's hands trembled, but his voice did not. "I'm here tonight because I remembered." The band began. Softly, Freddie closed his eyes and sang. The first note floated into space, fragile and honest. Then the next. Then the next. The voice that emerged was not the roaring weapon of legend. It was something deeper, warmer, truer. The crowd felt it instantly. People stopped cheering. They listened. Freddie sang as if he were alone on the beach at dawn. The world reduced to breath and sound. The song unfolded like confession and prayer combined. When it ended, the silence lasted a heartbeat too long. Then the crowd erupted, not with frenzy, with gratitude. Tears shimmered under the lights. Freddie's chest tightened. He continued. Song after song, the voice grew stronger, not forced, not perfect, alive. By the final note, Freddie Mercury was smiling through tears. Backstage afterward, he leaned against the wall, breathless, heart racing, alive in a way he had not felt in years. "You're back," Roger whispered. Freddie shook his head. "I never left. I just found my way again." That night, Freddie returned home and sat at the piano. He didn't play for hours. He simply sat. The next morning, he called Lena. "I sang," he said. She laughed softly. "I knew you would. I remembered who I was." "Good," she replied. "Don't forget again." Freddie didn't. In the months that followed, the music changed. The albums grew more intimate, the performances deeper. The legend became human and more powerful because of it. Years later, when people asked Freddie Mercury about that night, he would simply smile and say, "That was the night I came home to myself." If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who loves Freddie Mercury. If this story inspired you, remember, even legends face battles unknown to the world. Subscribe, leave a like, and share this video with someone who loves Freddie Mercury. This is the story of the moment the world almost lost Freddie Mercury, and the night he found himself again. It began in silence, not the silence of an audience waiting for a song, but the silence of a man sitting alone in the studio long after the music had stopped, staring at his own reflection in the glass, unable to recognize the voice that once made him feel infinite. For the first time in his life, Freddie Mercury, the man who turned sound into thunder and emotion, into legend, whispered the unthinkable. "I don't think I can do this anymore." His voice, once his greatest gift, felt distant, empty, borrowed. He no longer recognized the man who stepped into the booth. The fire that once lived in his chest had dimmed, replaced by exhaustion, fear, and the terrifying question of who he was without the music. He almost quit. He left the studio, walked the city alone under rain and streetlight, returned to an apartment that felt hollow, and faced the unbearable truth. For the first time in his life, Freddie Mercury didn't know who he was without his voice. Then came the call. A woman from his past. Someone who knew him before the legend, before the stage, before the world. She remembered him as Farrick, the boy who sang because he was lonely, because he wanted to be seen, because music was the only place he felt safe. She invited him to the sea. There, between the sound of waves and the weight of memory. She asked him to sing, not for the world, not for success, but for himself. His voice came out broken, but it came out, and for the first time in years, hope returned. Still, the world would not wait. The studio demanded a decision: continue recording or walk away forever. Freddie stood at the edge of his life, torn between fear of pretending and fear of disappearing. At dawn, standing alone on the shore, he sang again. The song was fragile, unfinished, but real. He chose to return, not as the man the world expected, as the man he was becoming. Back in the studio, everything changed. The voice that emerged was no longer a weapon of perfection. It was vulnerable, patient, alive. He no longer forced the music. He listened to it. For the first time in years, he laughed while recording, but doubt still followed him. The producers demanded he prove himself live. A surprise appearance. A real audience. 3 days to prepare. 3 days of fear. 3 days of wondering whether the voice would remain when the lights returned. On that night, Freddie stood backstage, listening to the crowd, the noise of a life he almost left behind. He stepped onto the stage not as a legend, but as a man searching for himself. He spoke. I almost gave this up, not because I stopped loving it, but because I forgot why I started. Then he sang, not with power, with truth. The crowd felt it. They didn't cheer. They listened. The voice that poured into the room was not invincible. It was human, warm, trembling with life. By the final note, Freddie Mercury was smiling through tears. He had remembered who he was. From that night on, everything changed. His music grew deeper, his performances more intimate, his legend more human and more powerful because of it. Years later, when asked about that night, he would simply say, "That was the night I came home to myself." This is not a story about fame. It is a story about identity, about losing yourself, about choosing to stay, about the courage to begin again when the world believes you are already complete. And that is why this moment matters. Because even legends sometimes forget who they are. And when they remember, the world listens.